I chose float nursing for the same reason most people in my particular situation choose float nursing. It offers the widest possible berth between showing up and being known. You arrive. You do the work. Nobody builds a complete picture of you. I've been floating for 3 years and 7 months. 4 hospitals, 2 states, always nights, always the ER when they'll have me, because that is where the float nurse is most useful and least scrutinized. I catalog exits. I note rotor signatures from the helipad 2 floors up. I keep my hands still and my badge visible and my history filed somewhere that doesn't touch the surface of anything. I am very good at the job, which is not a coincidence, but also not the point. The ER at Cascadia at 0400 has a specific atmosphere. The overhead fluorescents run at full hospital brightness, which means the light is the color of honest assessment, flat, total, nothing softened. The air is antiseptic and circulated, and somewhere under both of those, the faint copper note of blood that no ventilation system ever fully eliminates, which I stopped noticing 3 years ago and started noticing again 6 months ago, for reasons I haven't finished examining. The monitors chime in the disjointed, erratic rhythm I've memorized at 4 different hospitals now. And to the civilian staff, that rhythm means urgency. And to me, it means the room is talking to itself and everybody in it is still alive. I cataloged the exits my first shift. 5 of them. I noted the helipad access on the roof and the weight capacity posted beside the stairwell door, 12,000 pounds. Civilian medevac runs at 7. What exceeds 12,000 I have experience with and prefer not to inventory. But I inventoried it anyway, because you do. I kept the specific detail of who I was somewhere other than the present tense. I had spent 3 years and 7 months perfecting this arrangement. I saw no reason to stop. Dr. Elliot Greer found me at 0558. He was not the worst villain I have worked under in this building, or across the 4 hospitals and 2 states of my float career. He was efficient, credentialed, and possessed of the specific conviction that the organizational hierarchy of an ER exists to reflect his own importance within it. The attending who demonstrates capability in front of him is a challenge. The float nurse who demonstrates capability is an insult. He found me completing a peripheral IV placement in Bay 4. The patient had blown 3 lines, and I'd gone to the basilic vein approach because the standard sites were exhausted. A choice I'd made in field conditions with far fewer resources and which required no deliberation. It took 40 seconds. The line was good. Greer looked at the line. He looked at the patient. He looked at me. "You're not supposed to be placing lines that require positional technique," he said. His voice carried the full length of the department. The audience was the point. Float staff does standard peripheral access. That's it. The standard sites were gone, I said. The patient needed access. The basilic approach is within RN's scope. "You're afloat," he said. "In my department. You do not make independent judgment calls about vascular access strategy." He looked at the charge nurse, Louise Tan, who had materialized near the station. "Louise, reassign the float. Basic tasks, nothing clinical." He walked away without waiting for confirmation, which was his technique and which I had by now accepted as simply the weather. Louise gave me the look I'd learned to recognize at every hospital, the specific expression of a person navigating 2 competing obligations. And then she gave me a nod that meant, "I'm sorry." And also, "This is how it is." I returned it with one that meant, "I understand." And also, "You're fine." We developed this exchange over 6 weeks of working together, and it served us. I moved to the supply corridor. I pressed my back against the wall between the IV stands and the spare linen cart, and I looked at my hands. They were still. I pressed my thumbnail into the center of my left palm. a habit I'd carried out of a very different life. The way you carry things that are small enough to hide but too old to drop. And I thought about a ship hull in the Strait of Hormuz at 0230 on a night that smelled like blood and seawater and the specific cold of open ocean. I thought about the 7 operators I'd kept alive on that hull and the one I hadn't. I thought about the 8 years and 3 theaters that preceded that night and the 3 years and 7 months that followed it. Then I thought about what I was choosing every time I pressed my back against a supply corridor wall and held still instead. I decided the choice still made sense. And then I went to do the supply count. In 31 minutes, something was going to arrive at Cascadia Regional that had been looking for me for 3 years and 7 months. I didn't know that. I was counting sterile dressings in a fluorescent-lit corridor at 0643. And the morning was exactly as I had arranged it to be. At 0611, Dr. Greer returned. He came to the supply corridor directly, which meant he'd asked Louise where I was, and Louise had told him. Which meant whatever he wanted to say had been important enough to seek me out, rather than announce from a position of distance, which was unusual for him. He stopped in the doorway. "I want you to understand something," he said. Quiet this time. Private contempt is worse than public contempt because it removes the audience and leaves only the thing itself. This department functions because everyone understands their role. The float nurse's role is to support, not to improvise. When you make unauthorized clinical decisions, you create liability for me, for this hospital, and for yourself. He paused. "I'm recommending to administration that your float contract here not be renewed. I think this posting is beyond your scope." I looked at him. "Noted," I said. "I mean that professionally," he said. "Not personally." "I know," I said. Because I did. Men like Greer never meant anything personally. That was precisely the problem. He left. I finished the supply count. Dr. Elliot Greer had no idea. And I do not say this with anger, because anger requires more energy than he deserved. That the float nurse whose basilic vein approach had offended him held a Special Operations Combat Medic qualification that the Naval Special Warfare Command awards to fewer than 20 people per year. That she had served as the primary medical officer for 2 SEAL teams across 3 operational theaters, the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, and an engagement in the Strait of Hormuz in 2021 that remains classified at a level he would never encounter. That the 8 years between her commissioning and her separation had included decisions that were made in blood and darkness and open water, and that were later used as case studies in advanced trauma management courses she had never been asked to teach. That the basilic vein line he'd just criticized had been placed under conditions that included active boarding and hostile contact, with the patient losing blood at a rate that required it, while her hands ran the technique from muscle memory because conscious thought was occupied with other, more immediate problems. He had no idea. She had spent 3 years and 7 months making sure. At 0642, she thought, for the first time in 3 years and 7 months, that maybe the cost of making sure was too high. She put the thought back in its file and kept counting. The break room at 0645 smelled like burnt coffee and the lavender hand cream Louise used. I stood at the window looking at the pre-dawn Seattle gray, and I thought about Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Farrow. I didn't think about him often. When I did, I thought about the specific way he said, "Copy that, Doc," with the flat certainty of a man who had decided in advance that whatever the order was, he could execute it. He said it on the hull that night. Those were the last words I heard from him before the section of deck between us went wrong. I never saved Farrow. I have made peace with the operational reality that said it was not possible to save Farrow, And some days, the peace holds, and some days, it doesn't. This was one of the days it didn't. 62 seconds. Then I went back to work. At 0704, the ER changed. The vibration reached my fillings first. That specific low-frequency beat, heavier than anything civilian, the signature I'd been trained to identify at distance before the sound arrived. My body registered it 3 seconds before my brain finished processing what it was. I set down the chart I was holding and stood very still and listened. The civilian staff heard a helicopter. They heard it the way people hear things that aren't relevant to them, as sound, not information. I heard a UH-60M Blackhawk, modified for special operations transport. I identified the tail rotor configuration by its acoustic signature. I calculated the weight on approach as exceeding the civilian medevac envelope. I noted that it was not circling for the helipad. It was descending with the finality of something that had already made all its decisions. And then it landed on the roof. Around me, the ER did what overcapacity ERs do when an unscheduled military aircraft sets down on their building. The particular organized chaos of a system encountering something outside its training parameters. The charge desk lit up. The trauma bay activated. Greer appeared from the attending lounge, buttoning his coat, already projecting the calm authority of a man positioning himself at the center of a situation before he understands it. And then I pressed my back against the wall at the end of the bay corridor. Not my problem. I was a float nurse with a non-renewal recommendation on file. I was not the person this aircraft was looking for. I was not the person any aircraft was looking for anymore. 3 years and 7 months of choices had made that true, and I was maintaining those choices. My hands were shaking. I looked at them. They had not shaken in 3 years and 7 months. Not once. Not at a difficult line, not at a deteriorating patient. Not at Greer's particular brand of contempt delivered in a supply corridor at dawn. The hands that had been still on a ship hull in the Strait of Hormuz at 0230 were not steady in this supply corridor at 0706. I told them to stop. They didn't. The roof access door opened. The footsteps came through it with the distributed weight and measured pace of people who move as a unit when they aren't trying to. I heard them come down the service stairs, not the elevator, which was operationally correct. And then the door to the ER corridor opened, and they were in the room. 4 Navy personnel in service dress blues. Leading them, half a step ahead, the specific bearing of a flag officer, the way command settles into a body over decades, until the body can no longer arrange itself any other way. 2 stars on the shoulder boards. Rear Admiral James Calloway. I knew his name. I knew it the way you know things that are attached to people you served under, completely, involuntarily, in the specific full version that includes what they look like exhausted and what their voice sounds like over a radio in a bad situation and what they say when something goes wrong that cannot be fixed. He had aged since the Hormuz, not badly. The way metal ages under use, harder, more specific. Greer intercepted him at 10 feet, which was about how far ahead Greer's courage ran of his judgment. This is a restricted emergency department. Unscheduled landings require... Step aside, Calloway said. 2 words. Flat. Final. The tone of a man who has given more difficult orders in more dangerous places and found this one required no effort at all. Greer stepped aside. The tone alone accomplished it. Calloway scanned the room the way I'd watched him scan rooms before. The systematic sweep of someone building a complete picture in under 3 seconds. Cataloging position and role and threat level and who in the room was the person he was looking for. The staff watched him. Residents looked at each other. Louise stood at the charge desk with her hands very still. He completed the scan. He looked at the wall at the far end of the bay corridor. at me. I was the only person in the room who hadn't turned to look at him when he came in. He took one step forward, and then he said one word. Phoenix. Not a question, not a call, a statement. The way you state a grid coordinate when you have already confirmed the position and are simply announcing it to the room. The word landed in the ER, and the ER had no idea what to do with it. It was not a name anyone here recognized. It was not a call sign that meant anything to a single civilian person in that building. It meant everything to me. Phoenix. The name I'd been given on my second deployment and carried through 3. The name that went on the board when I flew out on a mission and came off it when I came back. The name that 4 SEAL teams and 2 admirals and 1 lieutenant junior grade who always said, "Copy that, Doc," had called me by, in places and conditions and configurations that I had spent 3 years and 7 months becoming too small to carry. I looked at my hands. They had stopped shaking. I looked at Calloway, and then I pushed off the wall. The operator on the stretcher behind him was losing the argument with his own body, and I didn't need anything else explained to me. Penetrating trauma, right thorax. I could see the wound track from 8 feet. Tension pneumothorax building on the right side, the chest wall already demonstrating the asymmetry that means the physics are wrong and getting worse. He was breathing in short pulls, each one less effective than the last. His color the specific shade of a man whose mediastinum is sliding. And then I walked past Calloway. I put my hand on the stretcher. "Bay 2, I said. My voice was not loud. It was the other kind. "And I need the room." The medic at the stretcher head looked at Calloway. Calloway said, "Do what she says." I looked at Greer. He was standing 8 feet away, with his mouth open at a specific angle. "I'm not Phoenix anymore," I said. "I'm Joanna Voss. I'm a float nurse. But I know exactly what this injury needs, and you do not. So you can assist me, or you can stand against that wall and watch." I looked at the room. Those are the 2 options. Decide. Greer chose the wall. He was smarter than I'd given him credit for. And then I was in Bay 2. The overhead exam lamps, the specific quality of surgical light that creates no shadows and permits no uncertainty about what you are seeing. I saw the wound entry. Right chest, 4th intercostal, the track of something that had passed through at an angle that placed the likely vascular involvement at the pulmonary hilum. Not immediately fatal, imminently fatal, without the right intervention. I named what I needed. Each item appeared in my hand within seconds, because the medics traveling with Calloway were the right kind of people and had the right kind of kit. I found the right 2nd intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line. 2 fingers. Landmark, landmark, confirm. The sequence I'd run in the dark on the hull and in the field station in Bahrain and on a Zodiac in the Red Sea with the water coming over the bow. I placed the needle. The decompression hiss was immediate. The chest wall began to equalize. The chest tube went in through the 4th intercostal anterior axillary line, the approach I preferred because I'd done it in positions where the standard posterior access wasn't available, and I'd learned to be accurate with the anterior approach regardless of conditions. Blunt dissection, finger sweep, tube placement angled posteriorly, confirmed with breath sounds, secured. I listened. Right lung, returning, left lung, clear. BP on the monitor, 88, climbing. The specific slow-motion rescue of a set of numbers moving in the right direction. I taped the dressing. I stepped back. Calloway was at the bay door. He had been there the entire time. He had not spoken. He had not moved. He had simply watched, with the expression of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time in a very specific direction and has just arrived at its destination. The medics were already assessing the patient's secondary injuries. The trauma attending who'd been called from the surgical floor arrived at the bay door, took one look at the chest tube and the monitor and the posture of the naval personnel, and made the professional judgment to wait for a briefing rather than interrupt a procedure that was already complete. Calloway looked at me. I became aware, in the silence that followed the procedure, of the ER staff behind him. Louise at the bay entrance, 2 nurses from the overnight team, the young resident from Bay 6 who had come to the door without deciding to. Greer still against the wall, which was where he had chosen to be. Calloway moved. He walked 3 steps into the bay, and he stopped in front of me. He was 61 years old. He had commanded 2 SEAL teams, a special warfare group, and a joint task force in 3 theaters. He had gray eyes and the weather-worked face of someone who had spent years outdoors, in conditions that made being outdoors somewhere pleasant seem like a different category of experience entirely. He was, by every metric I had ever understood the word to mean, not a man who wept. He looked at me for a long moment. And then something happened in his face that I did not expect, and that I am not certain I can describe with the precision it deserves. It was not collapse. It was not breakdown. It was the specific thing that happens when a person who has been holding something with both hands for a very long time finally puts it down. When the muscles that have been engaged for 3 years and 7 months release all at once, and the body expresses what the mind would not permit. His jaw moved first, then his eyes. Then the thing that was in his chest reached his face, and he could not stop it. And he did not try to stop it, which was the part that cost him something, because I had never, in 8 years of service, seen him not stop a thing he needed to stop. He said, "Ma'am." 1 word, 2 letters. The address a naval officer uses for a superior or an equal who has earned it absolutely. The address that, from a 2-star admiral to a float nurse in a hospital bay, means something so far outside the normal grammar of that exchange that the room did not initially know how to process it. His right hand came up, slow, deliberate. The full formal salute, not the quick functional acknowledgement of routine, but the version that takes 3 seconds and means something different from any other version. He was crying. He held the salute, and he was crying. Behind him, the 4 Navy personnel came to attention. The sound of their dress blues shifting was the only sound in the room. They brought their hands up. 4 salutes, held. I understood then why he was here. Not just for the operator on the table. For something else. For something that had been on his conscience for 3 years and 7 months. That had brought him through the Hormuz report and the after-action review and the loss notification and the board inquiry. That had arrived at the end of all of it unresolved. He had found me. He could not undo what had happened to Pharaoh. Neither could I. But he had found me, and he had watched me save the man on the table, and those 2 things had combined to release whatever he had been holding, and he was not going to stop it. And then I did not let it go either. I felt it entirely, and I held it. And then I raised my hand. I returned the salute. I held it for a long time. The room was very quiet. Louise had both hands over her mouth. The resident in the doorway looked as though he was witnessing something he would be trying to find the words for the rest of his life. Greer was against the wall with the expression of a man performing a rapid and uncomfortable inventory of every decision he had made that morning. Calloway lowered his hand. He did not look away. He said, in a voice that was completely steady now, because he had allowed himself the one thing and was done. "I've been looking for you since the Hormuz board. They told me you'd separated. They couldn't give me an address. I moved, I said. I know. He paused. I wanted you to know that the board's findings were correct, and that what you did that night was put in the record. All of it. The full record. He stopped. It should have been said to you directly. It wasn't. I'm saying it now. I looked at him. Pharaoh knew the risk, I said. He said, copy that, and he meant it. He did, Calloway said. He did mean it. We stood with that for a moment. The room led us. Calloway's senior aide appeared in the bay doorway, a commander, dressed blues, who looked at the two of us and understood with the specific awareness of someone who has served under a flag officer for years that this moment was finished. He gave a small nod that communicated the helicopter was available. Calloway looked at me one more time. For what it's worth, he said, from the record and from what I've seen in the last 8 minutes, you haven't slowed down. No, I said. I haven't. He nodded. He left. The record was read by his aide in the corridor outside Bay 2 before they departed, in a voice that carried through the ER without effort. Every title, every deployment, every theater, the Hormuz engagement, the citation that came from it, the specific number of personnel whose outcomes were directly attributed to her actions. The aide read the last line. The highest individual combat medical award available to Naval Special Warfare Support personnel, and the ER absorbed it in the particular silence of people receiving information that rearranges the room they're standing in. Greer stood against the wall throughout. I did not look at him. I didn't need to. I walked back to the supply corridor. The IV stands were where I'd left them. The spare linen cart was where it always was. And the supply count I'd been doing when Greer found me at 0611 was 3 items short of finished. I found my clipboard. I found my pen. I finished the count. Then I filed it at the charge desk, the way I always did, with the time and date and my initials. Louise was at the desk. She looked at the form. She looked at me. She opened her mouth. Don't, I said, gently. I'm fine. She nodded. I think she was also not done, somewhere in her chest, with what had just happened. I think a lot of people in that building spent a while working through it. I picked up the next chart. Base 6 needed a line restated. I did it correctly in under 40 seconds and made the notation and moved on.